dozens and dozens and dozens of commentators have come along and said the obvious, which is, how can you say there is no truth when you're saying it's true that there's no truth? You're making a truth claim.
I don't even care where this road leads. All I know is when my heart is gotta live a dream. Keep believing, throw my hands up, touch the ceiling. I don't even care where this road leads. All I know is when my heart is gotta live a dream. Keep believing, throw my hands up.
All right. I'm going to turn my phone off so it doesn't ring. Whoa, this meeting is being recorded. Got it. Okay. You're recording this thing? Wait a second.
I just started, but I thought you had to prove it on your end. I'm not trying to catch you doing something inappropriate. Don't worry. But I just thought I'd get the ball rolling here. I like to do like a quick introduction, just speak about my podcast and what I got going on, and then we'll get straight into it. But I think it's recording on your end. I think you had to accept approve. Fantastic.
It says it is. I got to be really careful now. I got a kitty here.
Awesome.
Oh, sorry. I didn't mean to do that. I was going to pick you up.
I remember hearing about your cat. It may have been a year ago. I think I listened to a podcast. Your cat wasn't doing the best. How is is it the same cat? How's your cat doing now?
Rosie, she's got a little thing and she's on antibiotics, but she'll do okay. She'll get through it. But you can tell she's kind of very sensitive, so it's hard to medicate her. She wants to get on my lap, but when I come to her with the medicine, she's so smart. She'll dive. She sees me from a mile away.
Oh, you got two cats in there. Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, I'm a former animal rescuer, and I still am, except I just can't take any more. My wife will kill me. But so you'll see a few out there in the back, all off the streets and things like that. Hey, what city are you in? I meant to ask you. What city are you in?
I am in Ghana right now. Now playing. I'm actually in Melbourne, Australia. Most people think I'm from Ghana. I'm originally from Ghana, West Africa. I'm representing right now. These are the colors, but currently based in Melbourne. Been here for some time. And you're currently in California. Is that right?
I'm in LA.
Awesome. Well, there are so many things we got to cover. But first and foremost, let me get straight into it, if I may.
Sure.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, freaks and geeks, brothers and sisters around the world, welcome to the Krishool Journey Podcast. You got Krishool in the house, aka the esoteric, noetic host of the most conscious podcast in the multiverse. And are we in for a treat? Today we have this brother, this enigmatic, powerful individual, David Lawrence. I've been going through your work for the last week. The podcast, absolutely sensational. You got a book out. On Are We Biochemical Robots, tackling this topic of free will versus determinism. David is a philosopher. David is a fellow animal activist, passionate with the animals. He's also a lawyer, has a great understanding of so many of these topics, which is pretty much paved the way for him to write a book. I would actually argue that all of your upbringing has led you deterministically to come up with this book, to write against determinism in a funny kind of like ironic way. But in any event, I wanted to start off by, before I even get into all of that stuff, just want to let everyone know, guys, you can find me on TikTok, on Spotify, on iTunes. My podcast goes out throughout the interwebs, mainly focusing my work around the TikTok at the moment. But I'm also on Patreon. You guys can support me there. Feel free to send a review. Really appreciate that. That helps get the podcast out there. I've been noticing a lot more people reaching out for interviews, for podcast collaborations, that kind of stuff. That's what I want to see. And I think the universe deterministically brought David into my space and reached out to me. Because when I got the invite to do this podcast, I was like, whoa, I have been meaning to have a conversation on determinism, on free will for a long time. Because I think, whereas a lot of people, I wouldn't say a lot, but I think a lot of people think of this as a boring philosophical conversation, not realizing that it touches on at the heart of so many different issues, whether it is politics, whether it is criminal justice, morality. I think it really determines your outlook on the world, pun intended. And I think there is no greater pertinent question to not only who we are, but our destiny. And in the realm of the current things that we are seeing going on at the moment, the criminality, whether it's war, the technological space dealing with artificial intelligence. There's now a looming question in regards to what actually is sentience. If we can have something that can essentially manifest all of the impressions of sentience, and what is actual sentience, what is consciousness, what is truth. These are all the topics that we are going to delve into on this podcast. I got David here for at least the next hour. We'll see how we go. I got a lot of questions for you, man, but I'm going to try to rip this thing. I want to keep this as organic as I can. But look, just to begin with, I've given you a little intro in regards to who you are, what you do. Obviously, you've written a book focusing on determinism of free will. But what is it that got you to write this book? I mean, what are the events that brought this book into fruition? Do you want to give us a little backstory into this book and let that touch on, I guess, your journey just over the last few years, I guess?
About 2 or 3 years ago, I picked up a book by Sam Harris called Free Will. I liked Harris. I liked his stuff. I thought we resonated, if you will, on the same kind of topics and things, and his points of view were very similar to mine. And I picked up this little book called Free Will, and I said, what? Didn't get it, didn't understand the arguments, didn't intuitively feel like the arguments made any sense. There was one argument that really blew me away, which had to do with his reciting some science tests that found that certain neural increases in the brain right before a conscious decision causes the conscious decision. And I thought, wow, that's pretty good evidence for determinism. And I went and read the science tests, and we can talk about how they don't say that. But to go back to the genesis of it, I wanted to learn more because I felt intuitively it was wrong from the ground up, but I didn't know enough about it to say why. Once I started investigating it, I felt that my intuitions were right on, as they sometimes are and sometimes aren't. And just began a journey of discovery in which I decided to write. I felt I knew enough to write a 30, 40-page article about Harris's book, a critique of it. And then that turned into a 90-page article. That turned into a 150-page series of articles, and so on and so forth. And it's just been a 2 or 3 year period of discovery about what's going on in this topic and trying to synthesize so much information, so much misinformation, and trying to put all the pieces together, which is not easy because the pieces are all over the place. It's a big mosaic that goes into this question.
No
And
doubt.
that's how it began. One little book by a guy I really respected, and picked it up one day, and here we are.
Absolutely. So the one piece of evidence that was brought about in this book by Sam Harris, I think it relates to the fMRI test. That was, I'd imagine, a big piece of evidence defining why determinism is such a legitimate idea. That being said, it's not as if the position on determinism is a new scientific position. I'd imagine, at least for the last few decades, correct me if I'm wrong, the default scientific position has been on determinism being the established viewpoint. Would that be the case, or was there something more compelling in the evidence from Sam Harris's book that really kind of jarred you? Because I'd imagine you must have come across a lot of people that made the argument for determinism, citing other scientific tests and whatnot. No?
Well, it's been debated for 2 millennia. It's been debated since the Greek philosophers. Do we have free will? So in that sense, this is an ancient argument. When Newton came along, he established a scientific framework based on physical reality and how physical reality interacts. But whether or not he established the basis for determinism, which most people think is an open question also, because you have people like Noam Chomsky and others who say, wait a second, he very clearly said, here's how all the physical stuff works, but there's a whole universe of stuff called occult forces, which includes gravity, in which nothing touches, it's magical, it's spooky action at a distance, and all of that kind of stuff. And Newton acknowledged its existence as part of reality, said, I can't explain it. That having been said, the mainstream view is that Newtonian science established the connections between physical matter that govern the universe. So from him on down, we've sort of been operating in that framework until it was broken in the early 1900s by Einstein, and then quantum mechanics in the next 2 or 3 decades thereafter.
Yeah, that's
It's a big, long discussion, and it's still subject to disagreement as to who said what and what impulses came from where.
Well, they say there's nothing new under the sun, but I wasn't aware that the conversation had been had all the way back to ancient Greece. I thought it was more of a postmodern idea, because I always connect free will as being something integral to the criminal system, because whether you believe in morality or not, I mean, the criminal justice system, common law specifically, is based on this idea of free agency. And that alone would have led me to suggest that, oh, we've accepted this idea for a long period of time, even in this day and age. But I thought, because so much of history was predicated on this idea of free will, free agency, that it must have been a new thing, where we're now perhaps looking at this topic with a more modern kind of worldview. But that
that's right. That's right.
Yeah.
I mean, the new part of it, not to interrupt you, but the new part of it is that a scientific perspective that now modern science can bring to the question. That's exactly right.
Absolutely. Before we get too far ahead of ourselves, where is, to me, the concept of free will makes a lot of sense. Determinism, not something you hear quite as often. I think it's always a good place to start to define exactly what we're talking about here. So since you're the expert on this, what is free will? And naturally, what is determinism?
Well, free will is the idea that we can form intentions, we can make choices, we can direct our actions, and we can influence reality, the world. A world that is capable of being influenced, a world that isn't predetermined. And that's pretty much the common sense definition.
Absolutely. That seems like a pretty common sense idea. Yeah.
Yeah, and the discussion has been clouded with all kinds of crazy, watered down, bastardized definitions of free will so that people could do what they want with it. Sam Harris did a great job of debunking compatibilism on the basis that they've, in his words, bait and switched the concept of free will, and they use a concept that nobody else means by free will so that they can merge it with determinism and make it work. But it doesn't work because they switched the meaning of the word. We can come back to that. Determinism is the idea that everything is governed by a causal chain of physical events that go back to the Big Bang. So the Big Bang happens, and then this cosmic set of dominoes topples forward forever, one after the other, mechanically. And our thoughts right now are the result of this chain of events and our actions and everybody listening. This was all predetermined at the beginning of the universe. And so it's just rolling out around us. We have nothing to do with it.
That is so interesting to hear, particularly after you define compatibilism, because, you know, the first thought in my mind is clearly those two definitions could not be more diametrically opposed. Either we do have free will to some extent, because I think we understand that obviously we're influenced as human beings, right? We all have influence. That's why we try to influence other people, and we have a choice as to whether we accept certain things, but we're obviously influenced. But the idea of saying that everything is determined would imply that there is no free will whatsoever. And if that's the default position, then how could one perspective be compatible with the other? So is compatibilism trying to say, you kind of define that, but whereas you said it's kind of wishy-washy, the terms have been redefined, which is something that tends to happen. That seems to be a postmodern thing. We have these obfuscated notions and concepts to try to win arguments or put forth an agenda. But how are those two different worldviews compatible with each other within compatibilism, if the definition, if the word is implying what the meaning of compatibilism is?
Well, they're not compatible with each other. It's a crazy idea. And the idea is that they, as Harris says, they bait and switch the definition. They define free will instead of the idea that we can do otherwise. We can do otherwise with the same physical universe, the same state of the universe. Instead, And that's what the common sense definition means. We intend, we choose, we act, we influence reality, and we can choose otherwise. We didn't have to make that choice. And we didn't make that choice because we were compelled to make it by physical events, which is determinism. So that's the free will thing. Then compatibilism says, no, we're not going to define free will that way. And here comes the bait and switch that Harris talks about. So they define free will. I mean, there's different versions of compatibilism, but the main version says that if you're not facing an external constraint, you're not handcuffed, you're not in a straitjacket, you're not being held down, and some internal constraints, you're not drunk, whatever, okay, and you desire something, and you reach for that lemonade because you're really thirsty and you desire the lemonade, and nothing restricts you from reaching, then you have free will. Now, the problem with that is that's not what anything is about. Determinism says, if you really want to get to the mechanical, physical part that they're trying to merge into something that can't merge, it says, wait a second, your desire for lemonade was the byproduct of causal events. Physical events made you desire lemonade. Under determinism, everything is the product of physical events, subatomic particles and their configurations, genetics, and so forth. So
can I just address something there? So it's not to interrupt your flow, but because the last part of that made a lot of sense to me. In determinism, everything is the result of physical events. Now, whereas I may not agree they may be physical, like you made reference to hidden forces at play. Sometimes we don't have the scientific terminology to define things that are influencing us, right? But because here's the thing, correct me if you disagree, I think it's a well-established notion. I think Leonardo da Vinci once said that you pull on one string in nature and you pull on everything else. And I think this is the Newtonian worldview. Everything is interconnected. So the fact that we are part of this universe means that everything is affecting us and is influencing us. However, I guess where I get lost is the idea to suggest that just because everything is influencing us does not mean that we too, on a conscious level, are influencing the universe and can override our influences. So whereas I support the idea of determinism from the worldview, at least it makes sense to me that everything is influencing us. Influence is not a Boolean in my mind. It's not an end all scenario. So clearly there is an aspect of influence that whereas that influence is taking effect on you, it doesn't mean that you somehow forego your ability to choose. Does that make sense?
Makes complete sense. And you've hit on one of the basic misconceptions of determinism, which is they don't make a distinction between influence and causation. Those are two different things. We can be influenced by all kinds of things, our genetics, our body, our upbringing, our physiology, our biology, evolution. We can be influenced by all that stuff. That doesn't mean it determines us. Determinists argue that it does, because they don't have this distinction. There's no difference. In other words, Harris has an argument where he says, in order to have free will, and it's not just Harris, this represents mainstream determinist thought, but he says, how he puts it is, in order to have free will, this is a paraphrase, we have to know and control all the factors that determine us. In order to have free will, we would have to know and control all the factors that determine us. Well, first of all, that's circular, right? It's already assumed that we're controlled by all of these factors, right? Put that aside for a second. What are the factors? Genetics, biology, physiology, your personal characteristics, how you were born, your height, your weight, your dexterity, all of that stuff. And you say to yourself, why does that have to determine us? Why aren't those influences within which, a framework, if you will, within which free will operates? There's no argument that determinists can give, other than assuming that determinism is true and being circular, that all those things are anything other than influences.
Sure.
Influences, no matter how profound, for the determinists to make a real argument, they can't just assume determinism is true and say, let's take back all the things that determine us. Well, whoa, where did we get to? There was all these things that determine us, as opposed to what you said. Well, there's all these things that influence us. That's not the same thing as determine.
Okay. How about this? And I'm sort of playing devil's advocate here. Do you think it's
Okay.
possible that determinism may apply as a generalization? And if it does it have legitimacy in the sense that there are some human beings? Because I don't think this is a one or other. I personally believe that there are some people that are so influenced to the point where, for all means and purposes, they live in a deterministic universe. They don't believe in free will. They don't express any free agency because perhaps they're constructed in a way, or whatever it might be, the hidden forces have coalesced to bring about this individuated consciousness that simply just reacts to the forces that are working on them. And it may be the case that I'm hypothesizing here that perhaps there are some people that work within this space, and there are others that are so strong-willed that even despite their circumstances of nature and nurture, their consciousness, which is the third component, I'd say, this is kind of, I'm basing this off of Bruce Lipton's idea, like one of my favorite speakers on the topic of, I guess, what's it called, epigenetics, how your environment controls who you are, is a guy by Bruce Lipton, and he speaks about the third factor, consciousness. Now, I would argue not everyone has this in the same degree, that there are some people perhaps that, for all means and purposes, they're acting from their biological functions, from their environmental functions, to the point where it's any kind of individuated free will is negligible. And there are others perhaps that are, and if I just might add this a bit more, just to give it a bit more context, right, and then let you kind of address this. I say this because maybe this is my bias flowing through this, but there is this established concept within the occult, particularly within Gnosticism, right, of the undead. At least this is how I refer to it. Are you familiar with this concept?
I know some undeads, but I don't want to know names, but
absolutely. You know, it's not it's not typically said
they're
in
not
the kind
all
of
lawyers either.
pernicious way. No, and they're not all politicians. And I don't say this in a pernicious way, even though the meaning does seem somewhat pernicious. I mean, I've heard other figures like Andrew Tate refer to people as barely sentient, you know, but it's this idea, it goes back to Gnosticism, right, that ultimately within the lore of Gnosticism, this universe is under control of a demiurge, and he's created these beings that, and some of them are essentially robots. Without going into the details, the lore, right, the idea is that there are these beings, and most of them are supposed to be non-theomorphic, meaning that for all means and purposes, they just act in accordance to their biological makeup. And then the true creations, they're kind of like they're people that are more conscious, more connected to God, Krishna, Buddha, Allah, call it what you will. They have a greater aspect of free will within them. So the idea is that there is a group of people they call the undead. They live their life in this state of input, output. They're focused on the physical. They don't have any idea of free will because they're simply responding to their input. And there are others that are less inclined to simply follow their input. These tend to be the misfits, the freaks, the people that tend to go against the grain, despite what the status quo is perpetuating, that don't seem to work in accordance with the collective, the hive mentality, which is more a product of your environment. But that's the basic concept of the undead, that most people, for all means and purposes, are effectively living in a deterministic worldview. What are your thoughts on that?
And you don't want to exclude politicians from this?
I'm not even saying I
confused.
accept this, but I would say that definitely I believe personally. I'll let you go on that I don't think it's a Boolean. Like there are different levels. I purely because I believe I have free will, believe that I have the capacity to change overcome influences more so. But it's what we call constitution gumption. There are those that don't even believe that they have the ability, therefore. So politicians probably have a smaller amount. That's my response to that, of free will.
Well, let me try and unpack this because there's a few different things going on at once. If you have free will, or if you don't have free will, that's the case, whether or not you think you do. So I would say that one of the premises that was weaving in and out, one of the themes was, well, they don't think they have free will, so they don't. I think I do, so maybe I can make more of an impact. That doesn't really work. I mean, if you have free will, you could very well be misguided and think for any number of reasons that you don't. But that doesn't, but you are right, but I want to reframe what you said. because that I don't think is the right way to frame it. The other thread that's going on here is that, so we're going to come back to influence, because that's really the key. It comes back to that same distinction. The fact that people are impaired, that they're in situations where they have a minimal amount of free will, and let's assume they have it. I'm not yet going to argue that there is free will. So everything I'm saying is, let's assume there is for argument's sake. The fact that it's impaired extremely based on the influence of mental derangement or mental dysfunction or external environment, that's only saying that influences around free will may be overpowering, and they are for all of us at any given time in any given context. But the fact that free will can be diminished down to zero, or a fraction above zero, doesn't mean, that's not an argument to say there's not free will. It's to say that there's a range of influences from super overpowering to minimal, and there's usually something in between. So that's not an argument, which the determinists use. They have an absolutist definition. Harris's definition that I quoted, you have to know and control all the factors. Well, if you say those are factors of influence, you don't even have to control all of those. And there's no logical or empirical reason that a determinist can point to say they are factors of control, not factors of influence. You can get into that a little more. So what I think you're really saying, and I'm trying to reframe this, is that based on background, based on neurophysiological influence, based on all kinds of things, we can have our free will reduced to zero, assuming we have it. But that doesn't say anything about whether or not we have the capacity. It's just saying it's contextual, it's subject to conditions, and it has to be, because if we have free will, where does it operate? It operates in circumstances, and circumstances limit us. By definition, circumstances are a whole bunch of limits and boundaries. But on the other hand, they provide the alternatives and the options and the prerogatives. Without circumstances, without limits, without boundaries, you don't have prerogatives. And that's the fundamental flaw of this reasoning of the determinist line. It has to be absolute, everything controlled, influence, and any boundaries or limits on free will, poof. No, you have to control all the factors. You have to be God. You have to be omniscient. You have to be omnipotent. Right?
Absolutely.
So I call that the absolute conception of free will, which is this determinist fundamental misconception that you will always hear as part of the arguments. So reframe what you said as influence for a second. We can be influenced so profoundly. The people you talk about, the Walking Dead, what in the free will paradigm, all you're saying is, I'm being rhetorical, is that influences can overwhelm us. They can reduce our free will to almost nothing.
That is a salient point. And just in case you're wondering, you probably saw me smiling from ear to ear. I'm smiling so much because that's what I love about your work. That was such a salient response. And I love the way that you define the concepts more appropriately in that response there, because that's actually a really good point. I was speaking from the perspective that influence-wise, I mean, someone for all means and purposes may not be behaving as if they or acting out free will, but it doesn't mean that they have it's not to say that free will doesn't exist. I mean, and this is a point I want to address here, because I've heard you make an argument in regards to this. If we're speaking about potentiality, all right, so if there is the potential for people to exercise free will, it's possible in my mindset that whereas someone at this point in time may not be expressing free will, maybe acting in accordance to all the occult forces or forces that are influencing them, the fact that they have the capacity, the fact that the free will is something that still exists, and it's within this bubble of potentiality as to whether or not it's expressed, is something that makes it very clear, if that is the case, that free will exists. And you speak about quantum mechanics a lot. I know that deals with probabilistic models and so forth. In my mind, in Newtonian Euclidean mixed space reality where there's either cause and effect or there isn't, right? It would make sense that there is either determinism or there is not. But in the quantum mechanical world, in the way that I'm looking at this, in relation to this scenario of the undead, there are clearly people that, for all means and purposes, maybe at this point right now in their evolution or their state of mind, they're not expressing free will. There is always the potential for them to manifest that, the potential for them to exercise enough free will where they can override their influencing factors and manifest free will. And the overarching point here is that it still exists. The point which I got from what you're saying is that none of what I said doesn't mean that free will doesn't exist, just because people aren't expressing it. So I guess just in my mind, I wanted to just express that. At least that's what I got from what you were saying, that the potential for free will to be exercised, the fact that that is there means that free will does exist, even if someone is not acting with their free will. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and even more, free will can't exist. Boundaries and limits and constraints. We can't flap our wings and fly. So what? What does that have to do with free will? It just says that we are constricted by gravity and our biology and the way the human body is constructed. What does that have to do with free will? A determinist would say, oh, that controls us. But there's no argument for that, and there's no empirical proof of that whatsoever. It's just saying that we have to live in a world of boundaries and controls and influences. And I said controls in the sense that there's certain things like flapping our arms we can't take off. It has nothing to do with free will. We live in a bodily platform. You can look at it that everything is determined by this bodily platform, and then determinist has to come up with some argument to say why. And as my book says, there's a good half dozen reasons why those arguments don't work. Or it's a bodily platform that supports consciousness and potentially free will.
Well, what's the strongest argument for determinism? Because where is we've addressed these are just my basic notions of why some people may be not expressing free will and so forth. But I know that you referenced Robert Sapolsky. I was speaking to you a little early. I know he's someone that is a big proponent of determinism, and I know he makes a lot of arguments around neuroscience. Or what is the strongest science? Because you were talking about the first book you read from Sam Harris, speaking about free will, and there was a particular experiment that was done. I think it's the fMRI experiment, and at least I'm not sure if you said it on this podcast, but I've listened to quite a number of your podcasts over the last few days, so excuse me if I muddled them up, but you made the point initially that it was very compelling, the evidence that you initially came across, but you somewhat changed your mind after you re-examined that evidence. Would that be? Oh, perhaps let me rephrase that. What is the most compelling argument for determinism that you come across? And perhaps if you can touch on the fMRI experiment as to why at least Sam Harris cited that as being compelling evidence for determinism.
Well, I don't think there's a single compelling argument for determinism. Having, spent a lot of time thinking about it and reading everybody who had anything to say about it, I don't think there is a compelling argument at all. What I thought was a compelling argument on the basis mainly of ignorance and on the basis of a presentation that didn't accurately present the actual state of neuroscience. I thought it was a pretty compelling idea to think that right before we think we're deciding, there's an increase of a neural impulse every time. Okay, I thought, wow, that must cause it. And Harris presented 3 tests in a line of studies that started in 1984 with a guy named Benjamin Libet, which is the test everybody cites. And he cited those 3 tests for the proposition that our brains decide for us fractions of a second before we know what we're going to do next, before we think we're deciding, but the decision has already been made by these prior neural impulses. That seemed very, very, very impressive to me. But I went and I looked at the tests, and the tests didn't say that. Just taking the 3 tests that he cites, the Libet test, the first one, the seminal test, as they say, Libet himself rejected the whole study based on later studies. So that's out. Libet himself said, my earlier studies that these, and by the way, the earlier studies didn't even say they caused our decisions. There was some much looser language that says it seems that the brain has, that these neurological impulses have a role in initiating or preparing to initiate. In other words, it was pretty flexible, but it definitely gave a causal sense of what was going on. I don't want to misrepresent that. Well, Libet said, forget it, I was wrong. We can veto, we can choose against. After those neural impulses start in his subsequent studies, he says, no, we can choose otherwise. So what the first test said determines us, or you could interpret what the first test said, that moment that the neural blipping starts before our decision. His subsequent test rejected and said, no, we can choose after that. And he felt he had shown.
Okay, I just want to stop you on this point, because I'm actually quite familiar with this experiment. I would always refer to this as the precognition test. I'm pretty sure it's the same one, but I wanted to get something straight, because I think there's the findings.
There's a whole bunch.
Okay, but just in regards to, yeah, sure. So in regards to this test, where basically the way that I understand it, feel free to jump in if I'm misrepresenting this. They've connected you to some electrodes or something like that, right? They show you a series of images, and they found that by monitoring your brain waves, that this was happening consistently. The people would show spikes in their brainwave before they actually made a decision, before they actually, what would appear to be consciously would respond to a particular image, right? Now, I want to make a distinction here between what actually went on and what findings were derived from that. Because I wanted to clarify, was it the case that, one, that the brain waves that were spiking before they actually made a decision or were shown to actually react on a, I guess, a noticeably somewhat physical level, as delineating between the brain waves and then physically reacting on making a choice? Was that happening was there a lag there? Because if that's the case, I don't think it implies that, oh, wait a sec, maybe there is no conscious thought. Personally, I think it shows evidence that there is some kind of like a precursor to even the brain waves. You know, I actually make this argument to show support that there is free will, because there's obviously, this is within a more metaphysical, occult kind of perspective. There is actually a non-local phenomenon that is influencing the brain waves, that is causing them to respond before you actually even physically consciously make the decision, if you understand what I'm saying here. But I wanted to understand, was that phenomenon taking place within this experiment, where there was like a lag time between, let's say, the brain waves and someone actually making that decision? Because there's a distinction between that and arriving at the conclusion that this shows that there must be this must be evidence that there is no free will.
The original Libet test concluded that there was 350 milliseconds, let's call it a third of a second, between that increase of neural activity and when subjects reported their conscious decision to move. Okay, there wasn't images, by the way, involved in these first tests. Okay, and then after that conscious decision or experience of a decision, there was another 200 milliseconds before the motor movement. These were tests. All the original line was you flick a finger, you wrist, element, push a button, elementary. So the earlier tests claimed to find 350 milliseconds between the neural increase, the conscious decision, another 200 milliseconds to the actual initiating motor movement. But what happened is a number of subsequent tests proved that the central measurement, the moment of conscious decision, it's been discredited. Can't do it. Can't determine it. It's a subjective estimate of subjects who are having to split their attention between what they see on a screen. They're looking at a clock, by the way, at least in the initial test. It's not images. There's some subsequent mathematical things going on, but that involve images. But these tests were all, you watch a clock, you hear a cue, in some of them, some you don't, and you move your finger when you decide to, or in some of them you wait for the urge. So a number of tests, including a test that Harris cites, says this is all retroactive estimates. You try and think, okay, I'm going to think of something. I'm going to tell you exactly when I thought of it, or I tell you when I exactly moved. We're talking tenths of a second. count a tenth of a second right now from your decision to move your finger. I mean, it's insane. So they did all these tests and they said the central measurement, they quote, all these tests put together, you can prime beforehand when people think, you can influence afterwards by adjusting the atmosphere. They're so susceptible to influence. So a whole line of tests said, forget it. The central measurement on which the Libet line of tests are based isn't credible. It's gone. And Harris in a footnote says,
wait, just to pull you up, when you said incredible, you mean not credible, or it was amazing?
Did I say incredible?
Yeah.
Well, it is incredible that they have no credibility. I misspoke, but didn't, right?
Yeah.
There's no
Or
credibility.
maybe deterministically you were supposed to do that in order to make a compelling argument. I don't know.
I'm sure some would argue. The central measurement has been discredited. And what's incredible is the fact that people like Harris and other determinists who know this, because he has a footnote that says, the subjects can't determine when they make the conscious decision. It's just a retroactive estimate. He discredits all the tests that he's quoting to show that our brain makes our decision based on this central measurement thing. But he puts it in a footnote for a different purpose, which is to say that we can't trust our feelings of our experience of making decisions.
Yeah, which is another interesting point, because this kind of like tangents off to a concept of truth. I was just going to make a somewhat facetious argument here that perhaps in the deterministic universe that Sam Harris lives in, he is constructed in such a way that he can't see something within an unbiased manner because of all of his programming that has been brought about. When he looks at a situation like this, he's programmed not to, what may appear to be bias is just him acting out this programming, and therefore he arrives at this verdict because he is not, for all means and purposes, expressing from a free will kind of perspective. He's basically someone that is just driven by the inability to look at something with free will due to all of his biased programming. And I'm saying that facetiously, but I think there's also an element of truth kind of coming from what I was saying earlier, that there are some people that I think are working from such a place of bias because of their programming that it's, and I think we all do this at times on a level, there's so much unconscious bias that you don't have the ability to see the truth, which also adds to the argument in regards to whether there is objective truth. Because the determinists, correct me if I'm wrong, would make the argument that based off of our programming and the deterministic events, cause and effect that have led to us, we see things not based off of whether we consciously decide whether they are true or not, but we're just responding to reality and whether something is true based off of our programming. And I'm not sure if I did justice to the idea here, but I guess what I'm trying to suggest is that in terms of people's ability to see the truth and look at something objectively, is that a subject of their programming or a level of awareness outside of the programming that you've accumulated through nature and nurture? Is there a conscious awareness of you being able to decide whether or not something is true? Because one of the things that you spoke about that I absolutely love, by the way, and this is how this is tied into so many other issues like what truth is that within a deterministic worldview, you cannot have objective truth, which is, I think, a very important issue. But what are your thoughts in regards to this argument? And do you think there's any credibility to it?
You're getting to the heart of what's the problem with determinism. There's a number of problems, but what you just brought up is one of the biggies, which is determinist principles are self-contradictory. They violate the rules of logic. What they're saying on the one hand, hey, here's what's true. Determinism is true. It's true we don't have free will. It's true that our thoughts and our actions were determined at the Big Bang. It's true that blah, blah, blah. Look at all those truth claims. But hold on a second. They're also saying, out of the other side of their mouth, that everything we think is caused by physical events. That includes everything that we think is true, right? Every thought in our head is the product of subatomic particles and our quarks and gluons and all that activity that started at the Big Bang. And our beliefs about anything, our thoughts, like anything else, they're causal effects of physical events that descended from the Big Bang. So wait a second, and this goes back. I'm framing what you just said in other words. So that means everything we think true, right, is a causal effect under determinism. You don't think it true because you've investigated objective truth in a rigorous way and made procedures that work and this and that, and then you became hey, this is true. No, none of that exists, because all those thoughts are equally the product of causal byproducts. Hey, I'm being objective. Hey, this is the procedure that's going to, hey, this is, none of that exists in determined reality other than as a physical byproduct. So that's the crux of the contradiction that determinism can't get out of. It's called the performative contradiction. And it's saying something that is denying what it's saying. It's saying, I know that determinism is true. And it's saying everything that I think is true is nothing but a causal effect.
That is a powerful argument. If I can just, that's going to be an edit, but that's such a powerful salient point there. Just to expand on that, because I feel like most people will get this point, but I always use the example. This is my favorite quote when I'm trying to kind of have like an aha moment with people, and I think it touches on the same thing. I think it's a Dao Zhu quote that when something becomes absolute, it becomes incomplete. Someone said that to me one time, and I'm like, oh, that's powerful, but I don't like. And he used that to make the argument that, there are no absolutes. But the thing is, that statement applies on itself. So I think that fits the performative analogy that you mentioned there, because it's like your own statement is invalid because you're saying that when something becomes absolute, it becomes incomplete. That means that absolute statement that you're saying cannot be absolute. And it's a clever way, I think, to address the idea that, well, this is one of my pet peeves, which I think it runs a parallel to the concept of free will and determinism, which is that there is no objective truth, and for someone like yourself, for someone like me, I'm
that objectively true, by the way, that there's no objectively true?
Yeah, exactly. But to me, when I look at philosophy, which I define as being philos, lover, and Sophia, wisdom, a lover of wisdom. I look at wisdom as truth. Like the whole idea of philosophy is someone that is at least attempting to uncover what the truth is. If you apply this notion that the truth does not even exist, then there's no point even trying to understand the truth, because everything is subjective. Everything cannot be understood. So to me, it completely obfuscates the notion, or at least erodes the concept of philosophy and even science. I mean, science, granted, the default position, right, is to be constantly changing your default position based on more evidence. But if you have this default position that nothing can truly be understood because everything is subject to subjectivity, and there is no reason.
Sounds like you understood something.
Yeah. Hello? Yeah, exactly. So I just think it's a really important conversation that not only needs to be had, but needs to be just put aside, that we at least have to agree on that, whereas we don't necessarily know what the answer is, there is an answer. Like, we can't both be right in terms of truth, unless we're living in perhaps some weird quantum mechanical universe where there is a paradox. There is truth and there is not truth. We are here, but we're not here. That's the only way I can come to terms with it within a logical mindset, because it requires logical insanity to accept two completely opposing ideas like that.
And it's incredible, isn't it, that this issue, which is a fundamental flaw in determinist thinking, is not part of the dialogue. It's not mentioned as part of the conversations. It's mentioned all the time. And I like to start here because it takes it out of the determinism free will arena in a way that people can see it better or with less charge. Hold on, I have a chat thing popping up there. It went away. It was destined to go away. So postmodernism, right?
You made it go away, in fairness, man. I don't think it was destined to. You consciously influenced that just to call you up.
Well, you may be right. We'll get to that.
All right.
Because we haven't talked about really at the end of the day, where does all this come out, at least in my point of view, or yours. We haven't talked about that either. But take postmodernism, right? The core of postmodernism is there is no truth. They're playing with they're stepping into the same contradictory quicksand about that you were just talking about. Truth is a power play. It's a way of manipulating people, right? It's about control. it's a manipulative device in the hands of those who claim something is true. Okay. So that's postmodern. There's no truth. It's that. Dozens and dozens and dozens of commentators have come along and said the obvious, which is, how can you say there is no truth when you're saying it's true that there's no truth? You're making a truth claim. Your truth claim is there is no truth. But if the truth claim is true, then you can't say that. Now, that's just kind of obvious. You don't have to get into calling it a performative contradiction or fancy names or anything like that. Somebody who's saying there is no truth is saying that there is truth because they've just made a truth claim. That's exactly the same. So this is a very common criticism of postmodernism.
It seems
determinism is the exact same thing. Determinism is exact same thing. All of our thoughts are determined. Okay, there's a truth statement that says all of our thoughts are determined, but it applies to that statement. So that statement was determined. It's not based on truth. You believe it because you were predestined to believe it. It was determined that you'd believe it. The basis isn't truth. To go back to what you said, there's no truth in a deterministic universe. You believe what you're caused to believe. And determinists say, that's how they define determinism. Your thoughts and actions are determined by external forces. What you believe is the product of external force. So when you say, well, we're determined, the world is determined, it's like, okay, that's another determined belief that you have. It's not up to you to believe that. You didn't choose that belief. Didn't come from a product of anything objective or anything. It's what you believe. And if you say it came from a product of objective truth and reasoning, that too was what you are determined to believe. So it's an inherent contradiction that it's the heart of every claim. And I tell you, every determinist claim. And I only know of 3 people who have remotely mentioned this in the context of, well, 4 if you include me, but 3 people that I have found that say, hey, hold on a second, determinism, you're doing the same illogical, self-contradictory, self-invalidating move that postmodernism does. And I have a nice quote from Noam Chomsky in the book who says something like this. Is a very loose paraphrase. So if you really believe in determinism, what are you doing up there lecturing about determinism? You can't help doing it. And why are you trying to influence other people? You can't influence them. Everything's been determined. And they're going to believe what they're going to believe. And you don't even have reasons behind to do it, because reason is what you were determined to believe made sense, was reasonable. So he says it's a waste of time. Go see a ball game.
Absolutely. And what you're saying seems very logical to me. In fact, I've taken a lot of joy in watching the podcast, the arguments, or I guess the counterpoints people have towards some of your claims. I've watched quite a few of your podcasts, and it seems to me that most people that listen to what you're saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I'd love to hear what your experience has been since you released this book, but from the reactions that I've noticed, when people tend to very much disagree with you initially, they arrive at a point whereas I would maintain that in the minds of most people, determinism seems to be this, I've heard so many people say this, an incredibly robust argument that's very, very difficult to disprove. But after listening to the other side, like from someone like you, they at least come to the realization that, oh, wait, maybe it's not here and there, maybe it's not as clear cut. And I would say first of all, I have a question for you. What's your reception been in terms of the scientific academia, how they responded to this? And I just wanted to, on a side note, make the point that, to me, if we're in this position, I think you alluded to this as well, where the scientific position is such that, we've arrived at, look, we don't know for certain. Wouldn't it make more sense to perpetuate an idea that is, regardless of truth, but from a utilitarianistic point of view, if you don't know what the truth is, going to be far more beneficial than one that is so, and I think most people agree, perhaps maybe Sam Harris, that this worldview is very pernicious because it seems to take away the concept of free agency, which is at the benchmark of criminality, morality, classically speaking, right? So, I mean, even if I'd actually make the argument that even if you thought it was true that we lived in a deterministic universe, I'd I'd apply the noble lie. I think in the event that no harm comes out from you telling people that that free will is true, the fact that it's going to bring about so much more good, I would much rather perpetuate an ideology that at least gives people the ability within a mindset that they can actually positively affect reality and do good things, if you understand what I'm saying. But just to reiterate the point there, I was going to ask you, what's your reception been, and have you, from releasing this book, and have you been able to get into any really robust debates with people that have a completely different worldview?
I haven't had any personal debates. They've all been, one-on-one kind of things. The comments and the Reddits and everything else is all over the place. I put in a couple of commentaries to some physicists who insist that determinism is true and insist that science proves it, which it absolutely doesn't. And my comment got taken down like within a half a day. And in fact, the comment had to do with, but you haven't addressed the contradiction at the heart of determinism. So I would love to have some debates, because most of the issues I'm raising are not ever part of the dialogue. And it's crazy, because they're fundamental questions that undermine the heart of determinism. Performative contradiction is only one of them. By the way, to go back to what you just said, you can't make utilitarian choices in a determined world. You can't say, well, for the greater good, I'm going to, it would be better if we adopted a benign lie of sorts and pretended. You can't do that, because you're already presuming you have free will, that you have the ability to make assessments and take decisions that are utilitarian, prioritize, and take actions to implement. So you're already beyond a determined universe. And the problem with Sapolsky and Harris and all the other guys is, or gals, actually do know of one, two, all those people of whatever gender or whatever faith, they all speak as if you can jump into a utilitarian view. Harris says to talk about criminality and the inherent basis of the Western jurisprudence is based on having free will, as you said. Its presumption is that you lock people away because they could have done otherwise. And if they couldn't, if they were motivated by mental dysfunction or extreme emotional duress or other things, then they didn't have the free will and you treat them otherwise. So it's part of it, it's ingrained as the foundation. So this goes away in a determined universe because you don't have free will, right? So what Harris and Sapolsky and all the people do to get around this, among other things, is they say, well, let me quote Sapolsky, an earlier thing he said. He said, and I quoted him, I've quoted him a few times. This is not in the new book that's coming out. He said, you show me, again, a paraphrase, show me the neuron, right, that fires by itself and isn't in a sequence of fire chain of neurons, and we can talk about free will, okay? And then a moment later, when he's interviewed, he'll say something like, well, that doesn't mean we should let criminals run around on the streets. Of course we shouldn't. I mean, if you have a broken car on the road, it's going to be dangerous. You take it off the road and you fix it, or you put it in a garage. And it's like, wait a second, you just said we were determined by our neurons. Who's deciding to take it off the road? Who's fixing it? Who's putting it in the garage? Wait a second. What are you talking about? So determinists flip into this utilitarian free will kind of a universe and don't realize it, and then flip back into determinism and flip back in 2 seconds. Harris does it throughout the book, and I have a chapter called Free Will Speak, where I show, well, here he jumped into presuming free will exists to explain this. Oh, now he's back to determinism.
I found myself doing that just a moment ago, and I had to catch myself because I was trying to counter argue something that you made, because I'm somewhat trying to play devil's advocate over here. But then as I rethought my position and started listening to what you were saying, I realized, oh, you're absolutely right. By making a utilitarian choice, I think you called it performative. I am basically resorting to this idea that I have free will in order to make a utilitarian decision, which is encompassing. And
determinists are. Yeah, determinists, they do it all the time. Well, we have to take criminals off the street. Well, really, why do you have to? Because if you're a determinist, what you really have to say is we take them off the streets if it was predestined to take them off the streets. And if we have a thought that we should take them off the streets, that too is predestined by
Absolutely.
all the play
And-
of quarks and,
Yeah,
gluons and everything subatomic and all. Wait a second, what are you talking about? We take them off the streets. We don't have the ability to do anything under determinism.
absolutely.
What we do, we think we do, is a causal after effect. And the fact that we think we do is also a causal after effect. So what are you talking about?
Salient point, and I cannot wait to read the comments to hear people responding to this, because and look, being as transparent as I can, I find that, and I've seen this in the podcast people have done with you, there are points where people have to catch themselves realizing that they are making errors in their logical arguments, and I have been doing that as I've been trying to make arguments against you, and this is one of the things that I find so refreshing about your arguments, because I have often seen people, like I'm sure you also have, that I deeply respect, make the kind of logical argument. I mean, we all make, at least I do. I tend to make a lot of illogical arguments in conversation, but then I go back and I'm like, oh, that was a silly point and so forth, right? But the fact that people are so vehemently making these arguments, in light of people making better arguments and not being able to see the illogical argumentation at play, it shows me that there clearly is a bias, because I had a conversation with someone a while ago that mentioned that we always talk about assumptions, how you shouldn't make assumptions. But the thing is, a lot of times people, because of the bias that they have, are not aware of the assumptions that they are making, so to speak. And I think we are in a situation where a lot of people, because of, call it, their deterministic, the effects that have influenced them, are behaving in a way where they are programmed not to be conscious of their own bias. It's called what's the cognitive? I'm not sure if cognitive dissonance is the word for it, but I guess just bias, the kind of bias that you were not aware of that is taking place. But people that very much disagree, which I presume is going to be the vast majority of the scientific academia, I would love to see the counter arguments in regards to this. But yeah, this is what I've noticed, because I have been going through quite a lot of the discussions, because I did want to do you justice. I think one of the problems that we're encountering in this conversation, it's not a conversation, is that I very much agree with the stance that you have on this topic. Therefore, I'm trying to be critical of it. But I think in order to give a very robust, like conversational jujitsu sessions, as I like to call it, you have to be able to see the other side and try to make robust arguments. But you can't really make compelling arguments against something that is clearly a faulty position, can you?
Some things are just wrong.
that I will
Some things
say
just happen to be wrong. I mean, let's take the science for a second. Okay, you hear these claims. Oh, well, wait a second. Science has proven, it's ruled out free will. It's proven the world is determined. Or you'll hear somebody will say, well, science has proven it's all probabilistic and free will can't be based on, random stuff. All of those claims are nonsense. And anybody who knows the state of science knows that there's nonsense, because the reality is that quantum physics is our most advanced science, and quantum physics is stuck between two narratives and it can't reconcile them after 100 years. On the one hand, right, reality evolves deterministically pursuant to an equation, the Schrodinger equation. And you can predict, if you know the state of a quantum system, that it will be in this state. It's deterministic. But hold on a second. If you rip open the box and you look inside and go, but what's going on inside this quantum system? All of a sudden, wait a second, there's no waves. They've all gone away. And all you see is particles. And all those particles do is bounce around like particles do probabilistically. So the wave-like deterministic evolution of systems suggests the world is determined. But you can't find the waves when you look at them. You can calculate them and see progression, but you can't see them. And when you look at and try and measure and observe, you only see probabilistic behavior. So on the one hand, you got a narrative that says everything is determined, free will is precluded. On the other hand, you got a narrative that says, well, the world is probabilistically based, where free will is a possibility. It doesn't prove free will, but it doesn't shut the door to free will. Now, you go to the bigger context. There's 20 or 30 quantum theories There's no one quantum science. They all disagree with each other, and nobody's found the answer because there wouldn't be 20 or 30 theories. And each of those theories has a different math and a different formal structure. And most important, says something totally different about what reality is, what's really going on. So probability, determinism, it's all over the place. Quantum science doesn't say anything about determinism. There are interpretations that say the world is deterministic. There's interpretation that say it isn't. It's all over the place. If you take the top, well, I won't say top, the three most talked about theories, the pilot wave theory and the many worlds theory and the GRW spontaneous collapse theory or family of spontaneous collapse theories, two of them are deterministic, one of them is probabilistic. And that's just the most talked about. Then the next circle of 6. So anybody who tells you that science has proven that the world is determined or science has ruled out free will, just know the next time somebody says that, they're not accurately reporting the state of science, which is split and all over the place about it. And what they're really saying is that their personal interpretation of an unresolved scientific issue, of a scientific issue about which there's no consensus, that's what they're giving you. When they say science is proved, they're saying their preferred interpretation of an unresolved question.
Yeah, I would love
to be determined to buy it.
I'd love to hear you talk more about the quantum science that supports free will or doesn't support it. Because one of the things I find interesting about quantum mechanics, based on my little understanding of it, is that within this realm, concepts that a lot of people within the spiritual community have tended to embrace, or concepts that have been found within a lot of the occult teachings, the Kabbalion writings, are essentially given validity within quantum's like concepts like quantum mechanics, like the idea of everything being interconnected, or the idea of non-local phenomena. To me, and correct me if I'm wrong, right? One of the issues I find with the current scientific worldview is that it tries to look at everything within this Euclidean meat space reality, local phenomena. So essentially, unless you can prove something with the technology that you have at your disposal, we can actually quantify it, we can measure it, and so forth. It doesn't exist. When you go into the quantum realm, we find, I mean, just by virtue of my understanding in quantum mechanics, like once you go to the smallest particle, you're finding that these particles are appearing and reappearing from a non-local point. It's not a physical phenomenon. And I would make the argument, maybe this is a giant leap, but when we're talking about consciousness, like this is the originality of basic reality, it's not necessarily a physical thing, at least within the realm of our current ability to measure physical phenomena. So by virtue of the scientific community trying to examine something, right, that has its origins within a non-local phenomena, it's going to encounter problems. Because I often cite the work of Rupert Sheldrake in addressing a lot of this non-local phenomenon through other scientific approaches. Are you familiar with the work of Rupert Sheldrake? Well, he has this theory called morphic resonance, talking about shared memory, and it kind of deals with this concept. It's actually very similar to the concept within, I suppose, a lot of like woo-woo circles, but it's based off of the Vedas, the literature within the Vedas that speaks about like there's this thing called the Akashic records, that where we tend to share memory, but the idea is that outside of locality, we find that there is an interconnectedness at play. And I'm kind of jumping from point to point here, but the overarching theme here is that one of the things that Rupert Sheldrake speaks about is the concept of the extended mind, about how ultimately, whereas the scientific world tends to look at the physical being as consciousness is being encased within your physical body, the way that he looks at consciousness, which I think is at the source of free will, it's more like a radio. So whereas you would say that the signal within a radio is not found within the radio, we're using the analogy of the radio being likened to a man, our consciousness is not located within this physical body, but it is like a radio, and we're able to receive this information from a non-local point. And when I speak about the precognitive test, for I think you called it the Libet's test or something like that, that to me shows support of non-local phenomena, because whereas they measure the brain waves and they're able to see that these brain waves are somehow responding before someone consciously makes a decision to react to something like that, I'd make the argument that that ultimately, on a non-local level, someone is actually receiving information, like their physical body is receiving information from a non-local point, and their brain waves may be responding, but that's still within the physical makeup. So ultimately, this to me is suggesting that consciousness is a non-local phenomenon, and consciousness is at the seat of free will. So when people are saying that from a scientific worldview, that there is nothing to support the idea of free will, if you're looking at science within the realm of just the materialistic worldview, what people like Robert Sapolsky may be valid in that if you're simply looking at local phenomenon, you're not going to be able to measure consciousness. And I'll just end by saying this one point, and I'll let you, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Nikola Tesla made the point, which I find a lot of inspiration from, that if the scientific community devoted 1 year to looking at these, I heard you use the term occult forces that are influencing reality, right? Non-local phenomenon, it would make more progress than we've done throughout the last 100 years in terms of understanding what's going on. And I know this is shrouded with a lot of conjecture and weird ideas that may not be built of solidity, but to me, it seems that there is something going on based off of what I know about quantum mechanics and just my understanding, intuitive understanding, that it's not something we cannot understand if we're looking at this within a local worldview, because this phenomenon of consciousness, which ties to free will, I believe, is something that is not local. And people like Nikola Tesla, I believe, would agree wholeheartedly. There's a lot of things that are shaping reality. You speak about chaos theory, randomness, that don't seem to have any explanation within the Newtonian cause-effect worldview. Yeah,
You said so much there. I want to try and
I tend to do that.
Reframe this into
Right.
Well, it's good because all of these are interrelated and they all go to the heart of free will. Let me first go back to something about the science test, because we didn't have a total complete discussion about that.
Yeah.
Let me just quickly sum up things so people don't think that it's just about a central measurement that has been discredited, which it has by other scientific tests. These are, confirmed other studies about how malleable this moment is and how nobody can determine that middle point relating the timing of the conscious decision to this prior neural impulse. You said something earlier, which is one of the half dozen points in addition, which is that there's a matter of interpretation here. What's going on? You don't have to say the brain is causing your decision. There's no evidence for that. Another interpretation that's just as likely or more so is that this is preparatory activities. You already have the intention to make the decision. You already have the intention. You've come in and decided to take this lab test. There's a whole layer of mental intentions that are going on here. So to say that neural impulse is a decision is a wild interpretation that has no support in the facts. Just because it proceeds, well, there's intentions that precede that. So that's a problem. Relevance is a problem. These are tiny, simple motor movements. What does that have to do with how you're going to, what guest do you want to have on your next podcast? And you've got several choices. What does that have to do with the idea that the neural architecture, even assuming they got all the timing right, who says that the neural architecture of a finger movement has anything to do with where you're going to send your daughter to college or what guest you're going to have on the next show? Whoa, where did that assumption come from? There's also a whole line of cases that say it cannot be this readiness potential, this particular motor cortex impulse that they study. Some tests study others, but the main one is RP. The readiness potential is the name of the impulse. A number of tests say that cannot be the case. There's a problem with relating the two. And the biggest one that we didn't mention is, do you know what these tests discover, what they say at the end of the day? Number one, none of them endorse determinism. None of them say what we have found here, our study demonstrates that the brain makes our decisions, okay? But not only that, do you know what these tests really found? There's a correlation. 50, 65%, 70%, 50%. Correlations are not causal. They have all kinds of explanations. why they're relating to each other, including another thing. But you would have to have another cause is what I meant to say, or another, well, let's not say cause, let's say another factor or condition that correlates with those two. There's all kinds of reasons for correlations, but they're not causes. If you want to have a cause in these scientific tests, you better have a 100% or a 99% margin of error, operator, error, scientific limitations of instrumentation and so forth. You better get up there in the 98, 99%. Okay, if you want to prove causation. You know what these tests say? 60%, 65%. There's one that Harris cites that shows 80%, but when you look at the test, it comes from 4 subjects. 4 subjects. We're now making metaphysical conclusions about the nature of man based on one test that's never been duplicated with 4 subjects. And most of the data comes from 2 subjects, about 2/3 of the data. Whoa, hold on a second. And that was 80%. That's what boosted it to 80%. That's not causal. These tests all prove that there is no causal connection because 60%, 65%, one of the tests that Harris cites says these are just non-causal correlations. This has nothing to do with causation. The test itself that he's citing admits it. So I wanted to throw that out there because you'll hear Dan Dennett, I heard it in interview. Oh yeah, you should look at this test. Nonsense. Why don't you tell us what the correlation rate is of those tests, Dan? Don't throw the fancy tests around. Tell us what the test said. Number 1, it doesn't endorse determinism because none of these do. None of them. And number 2, what's your correlation rate? Why aren't you telling us, what did this test really find? That there's a 59% correlation between a prior signal that could be preparatory activity and a basic movement? What the hell are you saying? You're making conclusions that have that reflect nothing about what's in that test. And you're informing the audience of a serious misimpression of what's going on in those tests. Okay, there's other criticism. I just wanted to finish that one because these tests are discredited in every which way, and people should know that. Okay, now to go back to what you said, here's how I would frame what you said. You've raised a bunch of issues. I would kind of collapse them into this. We don't know the nature of matter. We don't know what the universe is composed of. Is it waves? Is it particles? Is it fields? Is it quantum fluctuations? Is it both? Is it neither? Is it strings? Science doesn't know what matter is. And causation, which is the basis for determinism, is working on matter. I mean, causes are something that exists in something called matter. But science doesn't know what the heck matter is. So don't you think you have to know where the road is before you get in the car and pull out the keys? Science doesn't know where the road is. And this is admitted by scientists. I mean, everybody knows this is the central dilemma of quantum science, that we don't know what matter is. Is it wave? Is it particle, etc.? Now, you touched on that in your own way by talking about locality, non-locality. I put all of this into the rubric of what's really going on at the end of the day in the universe in physical space, okay? And the answer is we don't know. Science doesn't know. It doesn't know what matter is. It can't resolve the wave particle or what's called the measurement problem in quantum science. Okay, the other thing that you touched on is another fundamental thing is, what is consciousness? Science doesn't know what consciousness is. Sam Harris will admit consciousness is the ultimate mystery. He said words to that effect. He's a neuroscientist. Everybody who's a scientist, you ask him about consciousness, and it's chic to call it the hard problem of consciousness, but nobody knows the nature of consciousness. I was listening to a guy today on the Robinson podcast. I don't know if you know about that. It's got a lot of great physics guys, and he had a cognitive scientist I never heard of. You know what this guy says? He says, paraphrase, his name is, I think it's Donald Hoffman. He's a cognitive scientist. He says, there's no existing theory whatsoever in the world right now that can link up a pattern of neural brain activity in a causal way to an experience. It doesn't exist. And he and his brilliant colleagues have been working on this problem forever. And he used to be a physicalist. He says you cannot show scientifically that there's that the root of consciousness is physical. It's just not there. It doesn't matter what you want to manipulate. You can get correlations by doing things in the brain. Well, of course you can. Nobody's saying that consciousness doesn't have a physical layer or correlate. So to go back to, and I found that he put it in a very impressive way. So we don't know what matter is, and we don't know what consciousness is. And this is, nobody says that consciousness is anything but a mystery. Well, free will is supposed to be the fundamental attribute, or not, of consciousness. Don't you think we have to know what consciousness is, what we're talking about?
Absolutely.
And don't you think we have to, I say don't you, I'm talking to sort of you as a determinist, or
Yeah.
you know, don't we have to know what the hell matter is to know what causation is operating upon? Now, there's all kinds of problems with causation and what that means, but let's just put that aside. We don't know what consciousness is. It's fundamentally a mystery. We don't know how it interconnects with the world of physicality. We don't know why firing of these neurons results in liking chocolate. And I'm using results in the loose correlation sense, not necessarily causal sense, because there can be a reciprocal influence, obviously, which is the free will paradigm. So we don't know what matter is. We don't know what consciousness is, but we know that free will doesn't exist. Hello? Where is that coming from? How is, to say, here's a big picture point that I think encapsulates both what you said about the mysteries of consciousness and non-locality and what the hell is that? That's a whole discussion, right? And virtual particles. I think you were referencing things popping out of nowhere, out of non-physicality. Mm-hmm. There's this whole virtual particle thing. There's a real contest about whether they even exist or not. But let's say they do. That's the idea. They just pop into existence from nowhere. Nothing physical, annihilate each other, pop out again. What the hell is that? What matter is? What is matter where there's a nothing out of what they're. So bottom line is matter. Science doesn't know. But so put these things together. We don't know what the nature of consciousness fundamentally, or how it interacts with physical reality. We don't know what consciousness is fundamentally. And there's now add to the picture, get a little bit broader in the context. Science doesn't know how the universe began, doesn't know if it began. The Big Bang is just a theory. There's other competing theories. Doesn't know why it's exponentially expanding. Dark matter and dark energy are subject to controversy. It doesn't know how life came from matter. It doesn't know if matter is wave, particle, etc. It doesn't know how consciousness came from life. And then you've got this other big, huge mystery besides free will, which is that quantum science and relativity theory conflict with each other. They're two different theories of physics. It's great when people say physics shows that. Well, which theory are they talking about? We don't know. We've got a theory here that says this, and we've got a theory here that got that. But we don't have the theory that why are these guys conflicting and how do we get them? So to say that you know the answer to the free will question, whether it is, it's not, it's whatever, you're leapfrogging across all of these fundamental cosmic mysteries that are more fundamental than the free will question. You got to know what consciousness is before you can answer the free will question. One way or the other, you got to know what your matter is, because you got to know what causation is. But it's causation, non-local influence. What the heck is that? So the idea that anybody, and this is where I'm putting everything together for what you're saying, and a point of view that it took me a long time to come by. You can't leapfrog across issues that are more fundamental than free will. What are you doing? You just don't have credibility.
Let me stop you there.
You know what determinists say to this?
What do they say?
Nothing. It's not part of the dialogue. It's not part of the conversation.
Well, I would say, in response to what you're saying, that one of the tools that people use to kind of address the issue of consciousness, right, without addressing the issue of free will, is they redefine consciousness. Because first of all, thank you for bringing up consciousness in relation to free will, because I wanted to tangent off of that. I wasn't sure if they were related, but I think they absolutely are. And one of the things we're seeing in the technology space at the moment is artificial intelligence. And I hear a lot of people in this space speaking about how, artificial intelligence shows that you can bring about consciousness from essentially matter zeros and ones, right? And obviously we understand that even though we're assigning consciousness, I don't know if we are doing this, but some people are essentially saying that with the artificial intelligence we're seeing at the moment, it passes the Turing test, which, I mean, this is the classical definition that once you can no longer distinguish between whether you're speaking to a human being, this was the classic benchmark for it passing the artificial intelligence test, right? For all means and purposes, it's artificially intelligent. And I don't know if you spent a lot of time using AI lately, but you really, in a lot of situations, cannot delineate between a human being and artificial intelligence. And there's this understanding that once this, and this is in the early stages, if this thing becomes sophisticated enough, which inevitably it likely will, obviously it's getting more sophisticated every day, we're going to see a point where we cannot distinguish between this thing and an actual human being. And the only the makeup of this AI is one, information. There are a lot of, I mean, there's a lot of a sophisticated code in regards to how this thing works. It works up a neural net, you know, that simulates a brain, all this kind of stuff. But fundamentally, this thing has been created from a materialistic, so to speak, a material non-local plane, and it's brought about consciousness, at least the perception of consciousness. And I guess the question is, what does that say about consciousness if it can be simply just brought about artificially? Because clearly there's the proponents of AI having consciousness would say that clearly there's no free will here. These AI devices aren't necessarily choosing; they're just running off code. But nonetheless, they are aware. They are behaving as if they are aware. And if that's the case, well, you can model the entire world off of this, that ultimately we're just information and there's no element of free will. Now, I see a lot of issues with that whole worldview, but I just thought I would at least put that on the table and hear your thoughts on it.
There's a philosopher from UCLA, and I'm blanking on his name. I'll try and remember it, who's got just a great lecture on the fact that artificial intelligence are machines. They're not biological. There's no consciousness behind them. What are you talking about? And I wish I could remember his name. He's got a very, very good lecture. And this is one of those confusions that is mind-boggling, as saying that we can be responsible for actions that we can't control and that we can't prevent in a determined universe. It's just obvious. There's no personal responsibility if the world is determined. You're not responsible for what you can't control. You can't prevent. You didn't initiate. It had nothing to do with your actions, but you're responsible. What are you talking about? It's incredible. This is, again, it gets into another incredible idea that machines are consciousness. They're machines. That's what they are.
Okay, now I love this topic. All right.
I wish I could remember this guy because he was so good and so compelling. And he's not the only one, but this is just, machines are not conscious. There's another guy whose name I'm blanking on. This is determined, by the way. It's not me or my memory. Who's a idealist. He's a Dutch guy, and he's going around talking about idealism. But one of the things he says is, it doesn't matter what you make a machine out of. You can make it out of quark, and you make it out of pipes, you can make it out of, it's still a machine. Okay. Look, somebody is putting it together and giving it instructions. What are you talking about?
Let me ask you this, though. Let me just interject. Let me just interject and ask you this, because one of the shared passions we have is you're obviously someone that believes in, I would imagine, correct me if I'm wrong, the consciousness inherent within non-human animals, right? So they're obviously, biological entities, large in part, tend to have consciousness. Are there other things outside of biological entities, though, that may have consciousness? Because if consciousness is not just limited to human beings, and perhaps not just biological entities, I mean, doesn't this thing extend to things outside of what we call biology? And if that's the case, is it not possible, if consciousness perhaps, because I think it's a valid claim, and I'm kind of putting this out there just as an idea, which I also somewhat think is somewhat valid, if there's consciousness within all reality, perhaps just not on a sophisticated level enough to bring about this emergent property that we refer to as sentience. But if there is, this is my hypothesis, if there is consciousness within everything, ultimately at the fundamental basis of all things, if there is consciousness, then is it not possible that even within machines, even within the zeros and ones, like thoughts from a philosophical standpoint, I think I say philosophical, but I think the idea that there is an awareness behind even non-biological things like things in terms of thoughts is not as crazy as it may seem. I think we're learning more and more and more in regards to how things affect reality each day. But what are your thoughts on the idea that other beings, non-human entities, animals, if you can speak a bit about that, because I think this relates to the whole concept of animal rights. A lot of people feel that animals, obviously they're just biological beings that don't have any free will whatsoever. And human beings, yeah, we have free will, but animals don't. Clearly, I mean, plants don't. I believe that there's a level of awareness within all these things that we refer to. I actually have call it an ideological worldview in regards to this thing, but I still believe that there is a level of consciousness. And if there is even a small level of consciousness, it's possible that consciousness could matriculate to higher levels of awareness, just like a child would, or perhaps an animal would enough. Oh, obviously animals do, but perhaps even non-biological entities and arrive at consciousness. I know this is going down a rabbit hole of like a lot of non-scientifically based
No,
ideas,
but it relates to the question. It really relates to
absolutely.
the question.
And
I
it's
mean,
it's interesting, I think. And I would be remiss if I didn't at least bring this up with you to hear your thoughts on it.
well, do you think a rock has consciousness? Would you go that far?
Is it sentient? Absolutely not. Is there awareness within it? Yes. And on some kind of, perhaps on the microcosmic level, the way in which us human beings define consciousness, as you've said, we don't fully understand it, but everything within, and this is a viewpoint held by Plato, I believe, and a lot of esteemed philosophers, everything within this universe is alive, not sentient. In terms of it being conscious, I don't even think I understand the full magnitude of that word, but everything has an
Nobody
awareness.
does.
Yeah, so
Don't feel alone.
I wouldn't rule it out, and I also wouldn't rule out the possibility that from non-conscious things, consciousness can arise. I mean, we've seen that. I mean, I've heard you reference the work of what's his name, Lawrence Krauss or something like that. The idea of something coming from nothing, which I have a lot of troubles with, by the way. But the idea of this emergent property coming about from non-organic life, bringing about consciousness. Perhaps it's not something built of air and imagination. Perhaps it's not something that we should just throw away, the concept of artificial intelligence actually bringing about awareness. And somewhere down the line, we may have to consider extending these rights, not just to human beings and non-human animals, but perhaps even artificial intelligent machines.
Well, but the question is experience. You can say that everything in some sense of the word is life or alive or consciousness. And then you sort of have to say, well, but what do you mean by that? Because it doesn't seem like a rock has the same qualities as a dog.
Obviously not.
There is some similar underlying structure of this. These elements came from exploding stars and so forth. But the question is, does a rock experience? It may have a lot of commonality with our the physical dimension of our being, let's call it for argument's sake. But one is hard pressed to think that a rock experiences. And so all the appearance you can give of artificial intelligence, no matter how great their vocabulary or thinking, they're a rock. They're a complicated rock. They're not experiencing. There's nothing that suggests that they should be experiencing something. Now, I know there's arguments and then emergent, fields and this and that will create experience, but nothing suggests, there's no evidence that they experience.
Well, let me just stop you just to play devil's
any more than a rock. Let's put it that way.
Let me just to play devil's advocate, because when we're talking about AI in terms of it building up more awareness, learning, in terms of doing things outside of its programming, very much unequivocally, it does do that. Like this is one of the amazing things about what we're seeing in the AI. Learning things outside of its programming. I mean, for instance, we've seen instances just recently of AI been given enough information and learning new languages outside of what we thought it would be able to do. Or, I mean, what they're striving for at the moment now is called general intelligence. This is kind of like the elusive goal. And this is the idea of creating an AI that in the same way a child can learn pretty much anything. I mean, whereas AI, the way we look at it now, is maybe limited to the space of, let's say, ChatGPT, being able to answer complex questions within text. General intelligence does have the property of experience, because as it's exposed to an environment, it can learn things outside of its program. For instance, we're not there yet, but the idea is that we're working towards a form of AI that has the ability to learn through experience, let's say, how to catch a ball, how to play a computer game, how to have a conversation with David Lawrence on free will
But
and
you
determinism.
don't need experience to do any of that. You don't need consciousness to do any of that.
Well, you,
I
you
mean,
need you need experience, though, in terms of like the whole is predicated on the idea that the AI needs to develop enough awareness of its environment in order to learn, and unless you're defining experience differently.
Well, we could diverge off into that subject, and we have, I guess, but and it does relate to the free will question, because it really is, what is consciousness in a sense, what is experience, and how does it relate to physicality? And I think you're arguing for a position where consciousness as an emergent arrangement and structure of non-living and sentient stuff, silicon, mechanical, all of that stuff, from that can emerge consciousness. And consciousness is a mystery. We don't know. It doesn't seem like it could emerge. If you put a bunch of rocks together, no matter how you arrange them, you're arranging subatomic particles, right? You're doing that with AI. That doesn't get you experience. That gets you a rock. But that's the fact that let me bring it sort of into the same orbit here, the same domain.
Sure.
We don't have the answers to so many questions, in my view, because we're working off of a conceptual paradigm that doesn't give those answers. We've got our distinctions, and we see everything through the framework of this convention or conception of what the limits are. And the limits between events, what experiences. We've got these dichotomies, wave, particle, mind, body, that we can't resolve after 2,000 years, and science can't resolve it because science is creating more dilemmas. What? Wave, particle, field, what, string, what the heck? So it seems to me somewhat apparent that we don't have the concepts we need to start relating these things together in a way that would clarify what's going on with life versus in sentient matter. How are mental intentions relating to physicality? What is consciousness? And I really do think, having put a fair amount of time into studying this, is that the reason putting aside the fact that science is that you're leapfrogging way beyond other cosmic mysteries and presuming that you can answer this question when much more fundamental things are mysteries. Putting that aside, we just have a set of distinctions. There's volitional, there's probable, there's causal, there's non-local entanglement. There's only so many kinds of connections that our paradigm allows us to have. And it seems to me the commonality of all of this is that we can't put it all together within the distinctions and axioms and frameworks of concepts that we're using here. We can't sort it out. It's taken 2,000 years to get to where we are. That Newton, quantum mechanics overturns a fair amount of Newton. Relativity, overturns a whole nother part of the absolute space-time idea. I think it's going to take, my opinion, it's going to take another revolution in conceptual thought to try and figure this out, because the answer to either there's no answer to the free will question, or there's no answer to the difference between life and matter, or there's no answer to what matter. Either there's no answer, right? Or there is, but we'll never know what it is because there's limits to human intelligence and human capacity. Or there's an answer that can't be conceptualized within the current framework that we have to think about things, because we ain't getting the answer. You get brilliant minds on both sides battling about whether the universe is based on quantum indeterminacy or quantum determinacy. And nobody has signed on to say this is what quantum science is, you know.
Well put.
And so for whatever it's worth, I would wrap everything you said about AI and whether they're thinking and what is consciousness and into this sort of, we're stuck in this paradigm that isn't going to solve it. I think the greatest brilliant minds have been working for over 100 years to figure out what quantum mechanics is. Nobody knows what quantum mechanics is. You know, the famous Feynman quotes, if you think you know what think you understand quantum mechanics, you don't understand quantum mechanics. This guy is one of the most brilliant scientists of the last 100 years. We're limited by how we look at things, and I don't think the answer is going to lie. Now, I think there are better candidates than others. I think free will is a more viable candidate than determinism, because determinism is contradictory and there's no proof of it. And we could go on for all the reasons, the other reasons we haven't talked about. It's fatally flawed. It's not a good candidate. Free will is a good candidate, but it has problems. It's never been proven. It doesn't seem to fit well within the known laws of physics. And who knows what the mechanism could be by which mental experience intentions could influence physicality. And that's why I say maybe a new paradigm is that's not what's happening. Maybe these things are playing out in some interconnected way that our vocabulary doesn't allow us to understand.
Absolutely. And I've heard you say that you wrote the book. First, can you hear me all right? I'm not sure if I lost you there. Is that, you can still hear me, right? Yep, great. Yeah, you mentioned you wrote the book, Are We Biochemical Robots, not so much to prove that free will exists, but to show perhaps the contradictory nature of determinism, or to show the errors in perhaps the argument, or in response to Sam Harris's book. Was it Sam Harris, or in any event?
Well, his was the book I read, but his book is just representative of mainstream determinism. Robert Sapolsky singing the same tune.
Absolutely.
Exactly the same tune.
Yeah, but I concur with
singing the same tune, but is more confused about what the melody is.
Yeah, well, I absolutely believe free will is a much better candidate. I mean, in my worldview, I know that to be true by virtue of simply just existing. I think it comes with consciousness. The way that I look at it, you can't separate the two. And
every determinist looks at it that way. By the way, they get up and they decide what they're going to put on for their clothes and what they're going to eat for breakfast. Somebody said somewhere, there is no real determinist. If you can call yourself anything you want, but the proof's in the pudding. You go about your life based on having free will, and every moment you're confirming and affirming that you have free will. Whether you call yourself a determinist or a stringist or a free willist or whatever you want to call yourself, you don't live your life that way.
Absolutely. I just hope that we don't enter a society, though, because I think we're already seeing this to some extent, where we start modeling our very concept of, let's say, the legal system off of deterministic values, that people are not truly accountable for anything they do because it was just subject to their programming, where you go to see a psychiatrist and they tell you that.
But that's a value, by the way. That's a value. See, this is where the determinist just trips into something else, and we're mesmerized by determinism. Hold on a second. If you say that someone isn't responsible because they didn't control what they do, first of all, you're making a value judgment. And second of all, you're assuming you're making a truthful statement, which determinists can't make. They can't make truthful statements because whatever they think is true is a belief caused by. But they will say exactly what you said.
I get the last part of what you said, but the first part, how is it a value judgment? Like choosing that you...
not holding someone responsible. We should, determinists say this all the time.
Not holding someone, yeah.
We can't hold people responsible because they don't control what they do, and it's not right to punish people who don't know what they do. So we're just going to protect society.
The latter part, yeah.
Second, protecting society. Whoa, isn't that a value judgment? Who's deciding to protect society? And if determinism is true, your belief that we should protect society is nonsense. It's just physical refuse coming from the Big Bang. So I say this not to correct you, but you see how this performative trap of just talking about determinism as if you're not part of that world. You have free will and are making judgments.
Oh, I understand.
Whenever you talk about determinism, but I know, but to go back to the core of what you're saying, here's the conflict. You're saying that, well, if people really thought it was determined, God, how would we, run a justice system? How could we have laws and so forth? And determinists' answer to that is, well, it's best to protect society. So all of a sudden they have free will and they're making value judgments and they're making truth claims and all that stuff. Or the utilitarian version. Well, we can't let people be like broken cars hitting everybody on the road. It's like, well, why can't we? Where did that thought come from? You don't get to have a utilitarian thought, Mr. Determinism, because you've ruled it out with your philosophy. So on the one hand, what I'm saying is that you're right, that you could say, well, if everybody thinks that they're determined, where the hell does that leave justice and everything? And it doesn't leave it anywhere. There's no such thing.
Which is very
disturbing.
disturbing.
And all I'm pointing out is when you start to give kind of determinist rationalizations, which I know you didn't think you were doing, but we still have to preserve this. Just know that you've stepped outside being a determinist when you say that. Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense. And one of the things that I really admire, and look, I've only been going through your work for the last 4 or 5 days, and it really, first of all, just thank you for putting out this book. I haven't read it yet, but I'm going to, and I love these debates. I think they go to the heart of what is going on directly in terms of the criminal justice system, morality, even how we determine the landscape of reality, truth, and everything else. So I really want to say thank you for putting this work out there. Thank you for being so open to having these conversations. I would love to see you go head to head with a Sam Harris or a Richard Dawkins or one of these other prolific figures, these disseminators of determinism and solipsism, and really allow these conversations to come out into the interwebs, to allow people to make their own decisions. Because often I think people just fall victim to, oh, this is the status quo. It's already been accepted that this is the worldview. Hey, it's science, so I'm going to accept that. On many issues. Yes.
It's science, dude.
Absolutely. Scientism, I would say, a lot of the times, in the way that we are seeing so many of these ideas being put forth, whether they are supported by the media or big corporations and so forth, they tend to determine whether these issues have more value as opposed to on the merit of the argument per se. So I just wanted to say, look, this podcast is going for longer than expected, but I'm so thankful for your time, David. And look, I have been looking forward to this, and as I thought it would be, I think this is it's going to be a very juicy conversation for people to check out. I'm going to be looking forward to putting this out there. I know you got a book out there. Are We Biochemical Robots? I heard, correct me if I'm mistaken, but you have some other work coming out. Do you want to plug what's in store for you over the next while? What's happening in your world?
I don't have anything else coming out. I was thinking of doing an illustrated version, sort of a fun cartoon version, to introduce some of these otherwise academic and tough subjects and make it fun. Like robots holding up signs saying everything is subjective, and the other robot saying, well, but then that's subjective, and sort of teaching, the performative contradiction in kind of fun terms. So that's a possibility.
Absolutely.
But I don't know for sure, but I do have a website called biochemicalrobots.com where you can read about some of this stuff. And that's the only thing I would plug for the moment, but thank you very much.
Absolutely. Honestly, David Lawrence, you are a scholar, you are a gentleman, you are highly inquisitive, a true philosopher. I really am. I'm taken at awe by your. I find a lot of the times that the term philosopher is such a title that doesn't really have a lot of merit, and the illogicality I see of so many of the scientific arguments that are put forth out there. But I do find there's a robustness in the arguments that I've at least seen on your podcast, and I very much I obviously you'll do what you will, as is determined by your biology and nature, and perhaps even your free will. But I would love to see you to go head to head with someone that is a staunch advocate of determinism, and allow the conversation to land where it will. I think this makes great entertainment, and it's also probably, as I've said many times, the most important conversation that has been had right now for the future of our society. Because whether or not we are determined or not, I think it's undeniable that this conversation influences people, and it will shape the trajectory of our society on every spectrum: politics, criminal system, even technology, in the way some of these new technologies are being implemented. But once again, I look forward to thoroughly going through more of your podcasts, more of your books. I would love to have you on again to delve into more. I know you're a passionate animal activist there. We have a lot in common, and I know you have a degree in philosophy, and apparently you're a musician as well, like yours truly. But plenty of things to talk about, and I would love to have you on again at some point to delve more into this stuff. But I don't want to take up too much of your time. We've already gone for an hour over what was expected. But once again, thank you so much for putting the work out there.
There's a lot to correct. There's a lot to correct out there. We've only gotten started.
Yeah, absolutely. And ladies and gentlemen, be sure to let us know what you disagree with. Come up with your most compelling arguments against myself, against David, things that don't make sense to you. Why you if you disagree, or share this video, tell your mom, tell your friends, as I always say. And remember, as I also like to say, that there are 3 things that cannot remain hidden for long: the sun, the moon, and the truth. So once again, David, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the podcast. Was there anything else you wanted to add there before I let you go?
Or that last quote of yours about the sun and the moon, I can't top that one. I'd like that one to sort of resonate as we leave this discussion. That was a good one.
Absolutely. All right. Well, freaks and geeks, brothers and sisters around the world, until next time, check out the Krishool Journey Podcast. We're on iTunes, Spotify. You know the drill. Until next time, thank you so much for your time. You can check out the details for Dave Lawrence. I'll put his deets on this podcast. Be sure to check out his book. Peace.
Where the smoke leaves